all the way up to Spain eventually, and almost all the way into Vienna. I mean, eventually, the big fight was between the Ottomans by then. It changed a couple times, but you get the idea. It was Europe almost disappeared, and famously, the main reason that the final battle over Vienna didn't complete was because the Mughal, or the general, decided, the heck with it, it's not worth it, and quit before he would have certainly won and taken over Europe. By the way, that's why a lot of contemporary Europeans argue that the migration of people from the Middle East into Europe is essentially another attack, essentially, of the European people, because, of course, a lot of them are Islamic people that are moving in. So Muhammad may not have been able to write, but he married a woman who was able to write and who was also rich. He it's kind of fun. Apparently, he dictated to her the communications that he had from the angels, telling him what was important. In an analysis, by the way, of the Quran, what we find is that there are writings in the Quran that are somewhat 500 years old or so. So basically what it turns out, in an analysis of the Quran, that these are his favorite writings, that he was familiar with, probably that he had heard orally, but then he passed them on to his wife, and his wife wrote them down bit by bit. I mean, it wasn't all at once and so on. But in any case, it also strikes me as interesting that it's very similar to, if you're familiar with Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni. Yes? Help me if I screw this up at all. But the angel Moroni apparently told him where the golden tablets were, and he found them, and he used the Urim and the Thummim.
I can't see it.
Essentially, they're considered to be a pair of dice, and with the dice, you could actually then translate the golden tablets, which became the Book of Mormon. But he didn't write it himself. He dictated it to his wife behind a curtain. I don't know. Anybody? In any case, very similar to what Muhammad did. He didn't actually write them. He dictated them to his wife. I don't know if a curtain was involved, but in any case, that's just kind of interesting. And Islam means to submit to the will of Allah. So, sorry if I messed any of that up. Okay. And so Islam basically sweeps the Middle East and further. By the way, some sociological arguments will be that Islam was an ideal religion for the Arabs and for desert peoples. Of course, the big problem is if they take that religion and then try to convert Europe with it. Europe is not a desert, and so a lot of the things like the required clothing and so on, which might really be very good for people in the desert, doesn't really work in Paris. If that makes sense, or Germany, and so on. All right, but let me get back to Moses ben Maimon. Moses ben Maimon was Jewish, a Jewish scholar, a doctor. His title is Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. So you get this interesting title Rambam. And an interesting Jewish saying is that from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. What they mean is Moses, the one who led the Hebrews from Egypt, to Moses ben Maimon, who was also considered a absolutely great scholar. And Moses is familiar with Aristotle, because Aristotle is something that you could study not only in Spain but also in the Middle East. And he ends up not only becoming a great Hebrew scholar, but he also interprets the Hebrew religion, the Jewish religion, in light of Aristotelian philosophy. And remember, when we studied Plato and then Aristotle, what we got is idealism first, thank you Plato, and then we got Aristotelian philosophy. And it's actually quite difficult to teach a contemporary class the difference between Plato and Aristotle, because when we're talking about Plato and we're saying that there's these ideas that exist, that are invisible, but structure the universe, and then there's the material world, which is constantly changing. Well, that's not a surprise, because in a sense our culture already believes that. We already accept that as, yeah, of course, that's the way it is. But then you come along with Aristotle, and Aristotle says, well, but no, that's false, because what you have instead are the world of matter, and that's all there is. It's just that matter can be separated into the four causes, and the four causes are, the matter that everything consists of, which he calls substance, the shape that things take, which of course, and any substance has to be in a shape, so whatever shape it's in, that's its form, its shape, and it has to have the efficient cause, which, since matter is constantly evolving and changing, something changes the form from one shape to another. And whatever changes it, that's the efficient cause. And then the final cause, which is essentially the purpose that everything has, because everything, for Aristotle, everything is, kind of niched in its place in the great chain of being. So everything has its purpose, right? What is man? Man is a knower, right? Men like to know. So our job as humans, for Aristotle, is to know things, right? To be interested in philosophy, etc. Right? Well, what you've got under Aristotle is completely in conflict with Plato, but notice again, as contemporary Americans, we're familiar with all of Aristotle's description of things, and yeah, that's the way things are. We have no problem believing both in Plato's worldview and in Aristotle's worldview. Well, how did that happen, especially since there's serious conflicts between both of them? Well, Moses ben Maimon figures out a way in order to make the Jewish religion fit Aristotle's philosophy, and he passes that information on with other works, Aristotle's works, plus his own book called The Guide to the Perplexed. Let's see if I can get to that. Lots of other works. His 14-volume Mishnah Torah, the Polymath. Notice he starts off in Spain, but because of El Cid, they have to flee, and so he ends up moving to Africa and eventually ends up in Egypt. He studies Greek philosophy through Arabic translations, and where is death of his brother, becomes a physician, guide here. Commentary, Guide to the Perplexed. So this is one that's especially going to be influential on St. Thomas. By the way, the basic point of the Guide to the Perplexed is that when you're mixing Aristotle with the Jewish religion, what happens is you end up with a lot of complexities that create nuances in the way you understand your beliefs that are very complex. And as a result, he guides people to say, if you are not going to be a scholar and studying this stuff, don't sweat it. Don't study this stuff. So his guide is only teach people this complex problem that need it. The regular folks, the ones in the pews, the lambs, the sheep, the sheeple, don't teach them this stuff. It's too complex for them. They won't get it. They'll be confused. It's not good. Why mess with it, right?
You call that oppression?
Pardon?
Isn't that oppression?
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 It might feel oppressive, but basically, not everybody gets it. It's too difficult. By the way, our contemporary society argues everybody can get this, which is interesting, because it actually seems like no. Some people can talk to a room full of intelligent people and say absolutely idiotic things. We just saw that yesterday, right? So that's fun. However, so the Guide to the Perplexed, don't teach things that are complex to people that don't need it. All right. So, still on Maimonides, Albertus Magnus, and there we go, Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas studies with Albertus Magnus, and remember, he studied initially in the Benedictine monastery, so he's very familiar and understands the church dogma based on St. Augustine, who still dominates, right? That's a very important start for that. But he also then goes on and studies and becomes familiar with Aristotle and really gets it and really understands it and ends up realizing that this is superior. We have to adapt the faith to this science. And the main theme for him in doing all of this is to reconcile faith and reason. And the quote that I like especially is that faith and reason are the two wings on which we fly. You can't fly with just one. You need both. And by the way, if that sounds, an awful lot of folks today feel like, oh no, I just want science. Kansas, I think, is a state that insists that if you're going to teach our children anything, it has to be stuff we absolutely know. It has to be science. Where scientists keep pointing out that actually science doesn't really know for sure. They're just hypothesizing and creating new hypotheses and testing them, and then creating newer hypotheses and testing those. So there was a conflict between the very scientists and the Kansas school board to try to figure out, well, we just want you to teach things you know for sure, and the scientists are, no, we don't know anything for sure. And in fact, when you get right down to it, you need faith in order for you to do science. Why? Well, that's, remember, what we call axioms. When you look at, what is an axiom? We say axiomatic, etc. A statement or proposition which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. Well, I'm going to skip a little bit of time here and tell you how Kurt Gödel and his proof of incompleteness. I don't know if I mentioned, by the way, the one of my favorite books was by Rebecca Goldstein, and it's called Incompleteness, and it's about Kurt Gödel. It's kind of biographical, but she's also a philosophy PhD from Princeton, and she explains what Gödel was doing. So you don't just get a biography of Kurt Gödel, you also get an explanation, which I thought was really good, of what he's accomplished. And one of the things he accomplishes in the incompleteness theorem is to point out that and it's really actually pretty simple, that in anything scientific, it's based on axioms, which are the things that everybody believes you have. Remember, Euclid had axioms, and then definitions, axioms, and then propositions. So that's the way they do it, right? You definitions, okay, what is a thing, etc. But then you have axioms that seem absolutely necessary, right? Well, the trouble is, as he points out, that any system that's based on axioms cannot actually demonstrate that the axioms are true. So basically, you have to believe the axioms. In other words, you have to have faith in the axioms in order to do the science, right? You can't prove the axioms. You might have some axioms in some levels of science that can be proved by another level of science. So that's a complication there. But when you get right down to the basics, a thing is what it is, and not another thing. A thing is what it is, and not another thing. That's an axiom, right? Of thought, a law of thought. A thing either is something or it's not. That's the law of the excluded middle. This is either a cute little star or it's not. That's true, right? It's the law of the excluded middle. But if you actually think about it, you say something like A equals A, right? What do you think? Is that true? Yes, A equals A. A thing is what it is and not another thing, right? So that's true, right? Except, notice this A is on the left and this A is on the right. So they're not equal. Is that annoying or what, right? Literally, I think you can doubt any axiom. You might have to go, deeper than you might ordinarily want. What we'll see, of course, is later on that becomes a real issue for us. But so you do have to have faith. Take another example for one of my favorites. People know the game football, right? When you're playing football, you're not allowed to be off sides, right? So when you're kicking the ball at the beginning, you can't kick it into the other half of the field. You have to kick it into this side of the field, into your own side, and start there, right? In football, right? Otherwise, you're off sides. I should call it soccer, actually. Football. Europeans call it football. Americans call it soccer. But that's the rule, right? You have to do it that way. Plus, if you're playing along and you want to kick it outside of the field and go around the benches or something, you're not allowed to do that. That's against the rules. Well, what if someone said, I don't believe the rules? Right? Well, you've got the rule book. Here's the rules. And somebody says,